Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, it was supposed to be a safe zone. On Sunday night, Israel dropped at least 8 2,000-pound bombs on a tent encampment in Rafah, killing 45 people, a majority of whom were women and children, according to a doctor who treated victims of the bombing. Many of the dead bodies were severely burned, had amputated limbs, and were torn to pieces, the doctor told the New York Times. Graphic video footage emerged over the weekend, including one unforgettable image of a man holding a limp baby aloft while flames flickered in the background, silhouetting the fact that the child no longer had a head. Just days before, in The Atlantic, staff writer Graham Wood had penned what might be read as a justification for killing children. Quote, "It is possible to kill children legally," he wrote, "if, for example, one is being attacked by an enemy who hides behind them. It is possible to kill children legally," he wrote. Now we see where that logic leads. Monday, Netanyahu made a statement claiming responsibility for the Sunday night massacre, calling the choice to drop one-ton bombs on a tent city where millions of Gazans have been told to flee for their safety, quote, "a tragic mistake." But this time, something seems to have shifted. Media figures who've spent months defending Israel's siege on Gaza have found themselves confronted, finally, with an indefensible act. UK commentator Piers was one of those people. "A mistake?" tweeted Piers. "No, it wasn't. Netanyahu repeatedly said he'd attack Rafah, and he did. I've defended Israel's right to defend itself after October 7th, but slaughtering so many innocent people as they cower in a refugee camp is indefensible," he tweeted. "Stop this now, Netanyahu." I'd argue when you've launched a staunch defender like Piers Morgan, you may have lost the plot. Former USAID lead for disaster relief Jeremy Konadek tweeted, "Bombing a tent camp full of displaced people is a clear-cut, full-on war crime. Even if Hamas's troops were present, that does not absolve the IDF of the obligation to protect civilians. It does not turn a tent camp into a free fire zone." As anti-war protests broke out in Paris, even Israel ally Emmanuel Macron spoke out, tweeting, "Outraged by the Israeli strikes that have killed many displaced persons in Rafah. These operations must stop. There are no safe areas in Rafah for Palestinian civilians. I call for full respect for international law and an immediate ceasefire." The loudest and clearest anti-war voice among American elected officials has been Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American in Congress and one of 2 Muslim American Congress members censured by her colleagues early in the conflict for objecting to the violent murder and dispossession of Gazans in the name of Jewish self-determination. Let's take a listen to a little of what she had to say.
"It is disgraceful that the Biden administration and my colleagues in Congress continue to smear them for protesting to save lives, no matter faith or ethnicity. It is cowardly. But we're not going to forget in November, are we? President Biden, I hope you hear us loud and clear. Attacking the authority of the International Criminal Court and interfering in the legal process is nothing more than an attempt to prevent the genocidal maniac Netanyahu and his senior Israeli officials from being held accountable for those crimes against humanity. You are an enabler, President Biden."
Very pointed, very harsh, very specific criticisms of Joe Biden. So where is Joe Biden in all of this? We all remember Biden's interview with Jonathan Capehart back in March, in which he first floated the notion of a red line. Biden sort of said then that the invasion of Rafah would be a red line for him, but as soon as he drew that proverbial line in the sand, he erased it. The boundary proved to be as ephemeral, as unstable as the $320 million Gaza pier, which fittingly, over the weekend, washed away in heavy seas. Let's remind ourselves of what Biden had to say back in March.
What is your red line with Prime Minister Netanyahu? Do you have a red line? For instance, would invasion of Rafah, which you have urged him not to do, would that be a red line?
It is a red line, but I'm never going to leave Israel. The defense of Israel is still critical. So there's no red line. I'm going to cut off all weapons so they don't have the Iron Dome to protect them. They don't have. But there's red lines that if he crosses, and you cannot have 30,000 more Palestinians dead.
Now, the media framed not another 30,000 Palestinians dead as a meaningful red line, as though another 20,000, 5,000, or 500 dead might justify Israel's amorphous goals: defeating Hamas, self-defense. The establishment media mostly ignored that Biden went on to say, quote, "There is no red line. I'm never going to leave Israel. I'm never going to cut off weapons." And it celebrated Biden's so-called moderation. Biden supporters argue that this was evidence he was capable of being pushed left, unlike Trump. Disaffected anti-war voters were asked to trust Biden was on their side, that he had stern words for Netanyahu in private. We were told that Biden had paused a shipment of weapons to Israel because Netanyahu had crossed his red line by launching an invasion of Rafah. Of course, days later, Biden moved forward with another $1 billion in new arms for Israel, even as the Palestinian death toll mounted. A Biden booster account called "What Has 46 Done?" crowed just days before the Memorial Weekend massacre that, quote, "Hey, President Biden's gambit worked. Once again, he's really good at this." Cut to this past weekend, Israel's Rafah bombing video of decapitated babies and a young boy wailing as he watches his father's tent go up in flames, his father still inside. Only a fool would be surprised by this outcome. After all, what did Biden tell us? There is no red line. I'm never going to leave Israel. I'm never going to cut off weapons. Netanyahu, for what it's worth, has been honest about his goals. Quote, "We will enter Rafah and we will eliminate Hamas battalions there with or without a deal to achieve total victory," he announced in late April, even as military experts from Washington to Tel Aviv have warned that defeating Hamas was an ephemeral goal, a pipe dream. Bibi has also been clear that he will continue to act with impunity, that accountability from the international community for his war crimes would not be met with grace, but instead be met with retribution. For example, on May 1st, Axios reported that Israel threatened to punish the secular moderate Palestinian Authority in the West Bank if the International Criminal Court were to issue warrants against Netanyahu for war crimes. Fewer than 24 hours after the ICC prosecutor announced he was pursuing arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, Israel started a large-scale military invasion in Jenin in the West Bank that involved seizing homes to use as military bases and killing 8 Palestinians. 2 Palestinian boys were targeted by Israeli snipers and killed in that attack. Moreover, just today, The Guardian reported that Mossad Director Yossi Cohen was personally involved in a secret plot to pressure the former chief prosecutor of the ICC to abandon her war crimes investigation. The Mossad had transcripts of secret recordings of her husband and reportedly had been actively seeking compromising information on the prosecutor. This again, according to The Guardian. Another example of how Israel responds to attempts at holding it accountable. Friday, the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to halt its military offensive into Rafah, quote, immediately. The next day, Israel dropped bombs on a Rafah tent city filled with civilians. Remember also that within hours of the ICJ issuing its initial finding that what Israel is doing in Gaza could plausibly constitute a genocide, Israel launched an attack on the primary aid distribution organization in occupied Palestine, UNRWA, successfully lobbying the U.S. government to cut funding to the program and setting the stage for what World Food Program Director Cindy McCain has described as, quote, full-blown famine across northern Gaza. Recall also that just weeks ago, Israeli civilians set fire to the UNRWA headquarters in East Jerusalem. The perpetrators there were not punished. Saturday's Rafah bombing took place quite close to one of the largest UNRWA buildings. No place is safe in Gaza, the UNRWA comms director told the BBC. No one is safe, including aid workers. A pattern is emerging here, and it's one in which Israel reacts to accountability like a bully or an abuser. It responds with force directed at some of the most vulnerable and innocent, and it seems to bank on the global community being too scared to stand up to it. For some reason, up until this point, it's been working. The United States, the richest country in the history of the world with the biggest and most well-funded military by many orders of magnitude, is acting like Israel's hostage. Midday yesterday, many hours after images of carnage had taken over social media, the Biden administration finally made a statement. It says it is, quote, assessing if Israel violated Biden's red line with the Rafah strike. Former Ohio State Senator Nina Turner responded to the White House statement, tweeting, if bombing a refugee camp isn't over your red line is worthless. But Israel claims that steps were taken to reduce the risk of harming uninvolved civilians during the strike, including conducting aerial surveillance, the deployment of precise munitions by the Israeli Air Force, and additional intelligence. Israel is investigating the incident, much like they investigated themselves over a 2015 missile attack of 4 children on a Gaza beach, for which Israel exonerated itself. Just like Israel investigated itself over the 2014 Black Friday bombing campaign, which also involved military strikes in Rafah. It resulted in 200 dead in what Amnesty International described as an indiscriminate attack, hitting cars, ambulances, motorbikes, and civilians attempting to flee. Just like Israel investigated the sniper shooting of American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, much like Israel investigated the death of American peace activist Rachel Corrie, who was run over by an Israeli armored bulldozer and crushed to death, that too was deemed a mistake by an Israeli court. Just like Israel is investigating the World Central Kitchen targeted bombing, another accident. While Biden is still assessing Israel's behavior, and most major Western media outlets are running with the tragic mistake framing, I do take some comfort in the fact that more people do seem to be rejecting Israel's do crimes first, get absolution later approach. But if there is any chance at pressuring Biden, it will come from people like Tlaib, who are willing to buck partisan allegiances to apply direct pressure on Biden, not from politicians like Elizabeth Warren, who are willing to tweet out criticism of Netanyahu even when they voted to send him more American weapons, and remain silent on Biden's complicity. Biden said his red line is, quote, not another 30,000 dead. Well, the death toll hasn't budged in months because Israel has bombed and destroyed nearly every institution with the capacity to keep count. So who knows how many are really dead? The question, though, shouldn't be what's the real death toll. It should be obvious by now that by any moral metric, the red line is in the rearview mirror. The only question then is how to stop a genocidal actor and his accomplice, Biden, who happens to have the biggest army in the world at his disposal and no boundaries to be seen.
I mean, I think watching this is just horrible. All of the images coming out of Rafah, the deaths of so many innocent people caught in this war, and as you pointed out, people who have, like Piers Morgan, for example, who have supported Israel's right to retaliate after being attacked and to remove Hamas. But how many innocent people can be allowed to die in that effort before there's a change of course, particularly when, and this is where I think it's incumbent on the U.S. to get itself uninvolved in this as quickly as possible, because this will inspire violence and extremism and blowback against the U.S. if we're seen as the funders of these horrific attacks on innocent civilians. So this is a moment to certainly call for restraint and call for the U.S. government to reevaluate its unconditional military support for Israel, which is something I've said from the beginning, but only becomes more obvious at times like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because I think that's right. I also think that a lot of people saw that this was going to be the obvious outcome immediately after October 7th. But people who cautioned that there was likely to be a disproportionate Israeli response and that America should put guardrails on what the reaction should be were told that they were basically supporting Hamas, that they were indifferent to the tragedy of all the civilians who lost their lives, who were killed by Hamas on October 7th. And that to exercise any sort of restraint was to undermine Israel's right to exist or be dismissive of the Jewish right to self-determination, or all of these other kinds of fig leaves that really obscure the question of how many Palestinian lives do you think it's right for Israel to take in retribution for what happened on October 7th, especially given that these are not targeted attacks. The civilian ratios are widely out of skew with what we've seen in similar kinds of conflicts in the Middle East. And that now we've been going on in this way for 7 months, and red line after red line after red line has been crossed with not nary a flinch from the Biden administration. And even now, I mean, we started the show by talking about, how was our Memorial Day weekend. I mean, my real answer is it was very difficult to focus on anything else once this bombardment started, because social media was consumed with images that are many of which are too awful to show, or at least to show unblurred here on this program, including the one of a man holding up a baby that's literally without a head. And after months of hearing people lie about 40 beheaded babies, to hear Joe Biden lie multiple times about the existence of 40 beheaded babies, Israeli babies that never manifested, to hear all this silence about what we're seeing on camera is galling. And for America's response after all of this time to just be, we're evaluating whether a red line is crossed. I mean, hopefully the fiction of there being any kind of red line is now out the window, and that being the case, what does that mean for Joe Biden, who's endorsing this, tacitly or explicitly endorsing this kind of content?
Funding.
Funding, yes, absolutely. But this kind of conduct when he's in the middle of an election year.
I mean, it's not worse if he doesn't endorse it, but it's, in some sense, if he's against it but is continuing to fund them anyway, there's no
insanity.
American tax dollars can be put to any purpose, and no matter what they do with it, even if we don't like it, we're just going to shut up and deal with it. I don't think that's satisfying to people, regardless of their.
And so that's just one thing. I do want to put a really fine point in the fact that a lot of people are now coming out and saying what Netanyahu is doing is wrong. As far as I saw, Rashida Tlaib is the only one who I heard say what Biden is doing is wrong. And given that these are American politicians that I'm really focused on in trying to look at levers of American accountability, I do think it's very courageous for her, a Democrat in the middle of an election year, to be willing to go out and so pointedly criticize the president. And I do think there should be more of a push, and not to give undue credit to people like, Ro Khanna, Elizabeth Warren, or others who I'm glad are saying that Netanyahu is wrong, but at the end of the day are kind of skipping over the most immediate accountability lever they have in front of them, which is that they've already endorsed and do continue to support Joe Biden, without whom this tragedy could not take place.
More Rising right after this.